Okay, so this lecture is intended to provide sort of a very quick overview of developments in the Middle East that led to the rise of Islam and the expansion of the Muslim Empire, um, but also really to sort of give you a sense of what that part of the world looks like when the Crusaders get there for two reasons. One, to give you an idea of what seemed to be strike me as real similarities between sort of the early message of Islam and the early message of Christianity, particularly as it's articulated by Jesus in the formative years of that religion. Particularly thinking about notions of power, critiques of inequities in society, reaching out to sort of the poor people, those with less privilege. And sometimes I wonder to what extent they would have recognized those similarities. And perhaps that explains some of the coexistence that occurs later on. More importantly, however, one of the things that we'll talk about is why the First Crusaders are in fact successful, even though the odds are really stacked against them. And a lot of that has less to do with the effectiveness of the Crusade army and the lack of unity and divisions in the Muslim world in the late 11th century when the Crusaders first arrive. So we will explore sort of those two themes as we move through this lecture. This is actually a map, a manuscript map, one of the earliest maps that we have from a Muslim perspective, and it was probably first developed around 1020, 1050 in what's called the Book of Curiosities. It's a really incredible sort of manuscript that's at the Bodleian today, but gives sort of a Muslim perspective of what their world looked like. So pre-Islamic Arabia. So what's going on very, very early. So this is sort of at the time Rome is sort of collapsed within itself. And what you have, so this is the Arabian Peninsula. What you have then is they're very isolated. So even when you have sort of the height of Greek and Roman civilization, because of its topography, this part of that world is never really brought into the Greek or Roman orbit. It's tribal. So, blood is sort of the central unifying principle. It's not your profession, it's not what you do, it's sort of who you're related to, and that gives you a place within society. It also gives you a strong support network because you're relying on family. There's no uniform law code. There's no political centralization. All these tribes are essentially sort of autonomous and individual. And in terms of the religion, it's polytheistic. So lots of different sort of religious deities. It's animist, so that means they sort of assign human features or human attitudes to different deities. And they don't have sort of religious specialists. They have poets who are sort of keepers of the culture and sort of keepers of memory, who part of that cultural memory is also about religious traditions. So they'll sort of travel around and recite in verse different sort of religious stories. They also believe in something called jinn. And so, Disney takes this and makes this into genies, but like sort of spirits that like to interact with the human world. They're not good, they're not bad. Sometimes they cause a little bit of trouble, but they're just sort of present throughout. They do believe in a creator God, Allah, sort of the ultimate sort of force. And one of the things that all of the tribes recognize across the peninsula is the centrality of the Kaaba. So the Kaaba is sort of a square shrine in the center of the city of Mecca. And all of the different tribes have like sort of statues, different sort of religious statutes that are important to their tribal worship in the Kaaba. And so they'll come there on pilgrimage to sort of visit it. So to the extent that the Arabian Peninsula is brought into this sort of wider orbit, it's through the Silk Route and the caravan trade. And you can see through these lines how that trade sort of goes. So it's at the very north of the Arabian Peninsula through sort of modern day Iraq. And so this is moving goods out of Asia, especially China, but across Southeast Asia, where they'll pick up a lot of other sort of goods that you don't have in Western Europe. And then eventually they sort of make their way into sort of North Africa and up into Western Europe. So For a variety of reasons, and this early period isn't terribly well documented, we know that the Quraysh tribe, which is sort of centered in the city of Mecca, becomes very involved in this Silk Route. So what the locals do is they sort of hire their services out. Sometimes they're not exactly voluntary, as sort of protection. So as these caravan groups are going across that really tricky northern terrain, you sort of hire your services out as guides to help them navigate it, sources of water, which aren't always clear, to sort of understand if weather's going to turn, because it can turn on a dime, and then protection against sort of other groups who sort of see these caravans as very vulnerable. And so the Quraysh become very active in that. In part as a result of that involvement, we start to see, and again, this early period is not very well documented, so we rely upon what we have later, but we start to see shifts in the nature of this society. And in particular, something that's sort of new is the accumulation and concentration of wealth. And one of the things that happens as individuals accumulate sort of wealth, physical wealth, you start to see the emergence of materialism in society. So goods as an outward sign of your status, goods as an outward sign of how much you have. And then this is obviously going to lead to stratification, because some people have more, other people have less. And so you now have a much more hierarchical society than you do when it's still sort of tribal, and you don't have those real significant differences in people's sort of economic status. And the other thing that starts to happen is sort of money and power and one's position in this hierarchy start to become more defining, and then that sort of blood connection that you're related to someone becomes less significant. And so what we start to see is a real loss of the safety net that's embedded in these tribal societies. So instead of, if you are an orphan, someone takes you in. If you're a widow, someone takes you in because they're a member of your family. We start to see more and more of these individuals sort of on the margins, and this really sort of creates a lot of stress. This is a manuscript edition, or a manuscript image of early Mecca, and you can see sort of that black rectangular structure in the center is the Kaaba. So Muhammad is an individual who emerges from within this sort of Quraysh society. He is a member of the Quraysh tribe. He is a lesser clan, though, the Banu Hashim, and he is himself orphaned fairly early on. He ends up living with his grandparents for a time, and then he is taken in by his uncle Abdullah. And his uncle actually is active in the caravan trade, and this is kind of a fuzzy image of a contemporary image of a caravan. So Muhammad starts working with his uncle, and eventually he meets a widow, Khadija, who had inherited her husband's caravan trade, and she asks that he sort of take over, and they get married as well. So he is very active. He is traveling quite a bit. He is exposed to a lot of different places outside of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's all very formative on what happens next. So Muhammad, we know from other sources, around 610, starts to have a series of what he calls revelations. So what he says is that sort of the angel Gabriel is coming to him and gradually sort of revealing to him God's message. And the way this sort of unfolds is that this is not the first time that God has revealed his message to humankind. He did it sort of in the Old Testament, in the Psalms. He did it in some books of the New Testament. And so in part, Muhammad recognizes this long sort of tradition of revelations that connect Islam with Christianity and Judaism. And they are all considered sort of people of the book. But what's different now, according to Muhammad, is that this is the last and final moment of revelation. After that, everything will be revealed, and it's up to humankind to decide what to do moving forward. So the vision that Muhammad presents is an alternative to what he sees around him, and he sort of discusses this idea of an ummah, a community. And within this ummah, everybody, if they accept the message of God, of Allah, is equal. politically equal, militarily equal, economically equal. There are no leaders. There's no hierarchy. It's this incredibly equal message of sort of how he wants society to look moving forward. It is a monotheistic religion, so this is a dramatic departure from the polytheistic religious traditions of the people in this area. And he says there is not a plethora of gods, there is just one, and it's Allah. And he realizes that this is going to be a difficult sort of transition, and so he develops this understanding of embracing this message and embracing what he believes Allah wants individuals to do, which is to submit their personal will to that of God. And then this is difficult, and it's a constant struggle to do good, to do the right thing. And so this is the submission is the Muslim word or the Muslim sort of understanding of that is Islam. So Islam means submission. So in terms of that message, as he starts to sort of preach it, particularly in Mecca, is not terribly well received. It really threatens to undermine the Quraysh's sort of newly acquired wealth and status. And so he does have a few followers, people who accept this, especially from within sort of his family and his inner circle of friends, his wife Khadijah. But a lot of the Quraysh actually want him out. They want him gone. The only reason they haven't acted is he has the protection of his uncle and his clan. But when his uncle dies, the message is conveyed to him, either you leave or we will kill you. And so in 622, he and some of his followers gradually leave the city of Mecca. They are invited to come to a nearby city called Yathrib and to sort of lead that city. And so that's where he starts to build his community. And Yathrib the name is changed to Medina, the city of the prophet. For the next few years, though, there's going to be sort of an on and off war with the Quraysh in Mecca who want to eliminate Muhammad. And gradually, even though he has fewer followers and he's outnumbered, he continues to defeat the Quraysh. He continues to expand his following, in part as a result of his success, until 630, where he is in a position militarily to capture the city of Mecca and to force the Quraysh to either go into exile or to accept the message of Islam. And it's shortly after that he dies. And his death obviously sends sort of shockwaves throughout this very sort of young community in terms of what's going to happen moving forward. So what we start to see is sort of the organization of Muhammad's message, which is very personally delivered, into something more resembling sort of a formal set of ideas and principles. And so as early as the 630s, we start to see a deliberate attempt to write down his revelations. He would have revelations over the course of his lifetime. People would sort of write them down on whatever was handy, snippets of paper, sometimes like a slate tablet. And so you see under the first few sort of successors of Muhammad, this sort of realization that we need to collect these revelations and put them in one place so we can preserve them. This is an image of perhaps the oldest copy of the Quran that they knew about for a while, thought it was much older until they were able to do some carbon dating, and they realized that it's actually very close to contemporary with Muhammad's life, if not shortly thereafter. We also see the emergence of hadith. So the Quran is basically, it's in verse form. It's organized by the length of the surahs or the verses. It doesn't talk sort of specifically about Muhammad or about his life. It's more about sort of this message. Hadith are stories of Muhammad, of people's interactions with Muhammad, stories of Muhammad's childhood. And so they also provide sort of another sort of directive for people in terms of trying to sort of navigate moving forward what living life as a Muslim is going to look like. We also start to see the evolution of Sharia law, which is Muslim law. There's a lot of different forms of Sharia law, though there's no single sort of uniform law code. And the most important thing about this early sort of religious system is there is no orthodoxy in Islam. There is no single approved uniform set of beliefs or interpretations. Every Muslim is actually supposed to memorize the Quran or read the Quran and to sort of think about it for themselves. So you don't have priests who are the ones who tell you this is the right interpretation, this is the wrong interpretation. And that really sort of stands in stark contrast to what you have in Orthodox Roman Catholic traditions in the West, where there's a single, correct, uniform interpretation of everything. So what's going to happen after Muhammad's death? And this is a matter of a lot of negotiation because Muhammad himself didn't have an official title. And remember, that vision of this ummah was that everyone was equal. So you don't have a political hierarchy. You don't have a military hierarchy, in part because Muhammad was in those positions. So a few of the phrases that were used to refer to Muhammad's early successors. So Khalifa Rasul Allah is successor to the Prophet of Allah, which is really very vague, or Amir al-Mu'minin, which is commander of the faithful, also very vague. So they have to kind of figure out this community is too young to really stand on its own. It still needs some leadership, but what's that going to look like? So the first person to kind of take on the leadership role after Muhammad's death is one of his closest friends, Abu Bakr. He doesn't live for very long. He is sort of up in age. He's succeeded by another of Muhammad's close friends and early converts, Umar. And in part, the way succession works in the Rashidun, the first four successors of Muhammad, and Rashidun refers to these are considered the rightly guided caliphs. Succession happens by consensus of the community. The leaders of the community come together and they choose someone. This is going to start to sort of fracture. So then the third caliph, and there's a little bit more division emerging, is Uthman. And Uthman as a successor is questioned by some because he's actually a member of the Quraysh tribe, that tribe that initially opposed Muhammad. And there are also people who feel like the successor to Umar should have been Ali. Ali is Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. He was married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima, and so he has a lot of support because of that blood connection. So Uthman, in part because you see these divisions, is assassinated, and it's not really clear who was responsible, but his supporters blame Ali. So when Ali succeeds as caliph, there's still a lot of opposition to him, and that unrest is going to continue. But in spite of all that internal division, what we see during this period is this incredible expansion. So the one map shows you how far Islam expands during the lifetime of Muhammad and shortly after until right about his death. So about half of that Arabian Peninsula. Within the next 100 years, you see they move all the way up, and so they conquer all the Arabian Peninsula. They move eastward into modern-day Afghanistan. They conquer Jerusalem, Palestine, Lebanon, and Egypt, and are going to eventually continue that sort of expansion up into North Africa and Iberia. So it's this relatively very quick expansion that's really going to sort of reconfigure this whole Mediterranean world. So the other thing that happens is civil war. So what we see is after Ali dies, you see the death, or you see this, he's succeeded by Muawiyah. And Muawiyah also is somewhat opposed, though he has a fair amount of support. And when Muawiyah dies, he appoints his son Yazid as his successor. And this really sort of breaks that tradition of community consensus determining who is going to take over. So there's a lot of opposition to the way Muawiyah, as that fifth caliph, was running things. And in particular, he's making this into much more of a secular position and less of one of religious leadership. So when his son Yazid attempts to succeed, he's contested by people in particular around the area of Kufa. So you can see from this map, Kufa is near Iraq. And so Muawiyah and his son Yazid have really consolidated power in Egypt and along the coast. So the people of Kufa say, we don't acknowledge the legitimacy of Yazid. It's Hussein. Hussein is the younger son of Ali. And Hussein then sort of reluctantly accepts this mantle of leadership. He begins to travel to Kufa, when he is surrounded by an army sent by Yazid. He and his supporters are outnumbered. A very sort of short but bloody battle is fought at Karbala in 680, and Hussein and his followers are defeated. Yazid then takes over control, but you have the first real fragmentation within this Muslim community that's not just about political leadership, it also becomes about religious practice. And this is really significant moving forward in understanding what happens in the Muslim world. The people who believe that Ali, as Muhammad's blood relative, was the rightful caliph and should have been succeeded by his son Hussein, begin to identify as Shia, which means followers of Ali. And they see Ali as actually the first rightful caliph. They insist upon that blood principle. And what you start to see then in Shia Islam is very much separate from Sunni Islam, is the evolution of a hierarchy. So you have individuals called imams who have religious expertise, who have sort of this authority within the community. This is also a messianic religion. So they believe in someone called a Mahdi who is eventually going to sort of return to earth and usher in an end time. And then even within that, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, you have different splinter groups who have a different understanding of who that Mahdi is going to be. Is it going to be the 12th Imam, or is it going to be someone descended from Ishmael? So you have further division within the Shia community. And instead of Ramadan as sort of the most significant month within the Muslim calendar, Muharram, the 10th month, which is when the Battle of Karbala was fought on Ashura, the 10th day of Muharram, that becomes the central ritual within the Muslim calendar for Shia Muslims. So this division then is going to have significant implications moving forward. So as things continue to unfold under the Umayyad dynasty, what we start to see, the capital, essentially this Muslim empire, is moved from Mecca to Damascus, which is considered more centrally located. We start to see the emergence of a very well organized institution, or set of institutions. So the caliph will install governors in various places across the empire to help him govern. Increasingly, though, instead of being sort of a meritocracy where individuals who have proven themselves as military commanders then establish sort of control of a region, we start to see these Umayyad caliphs put family members into place, and it becomes so an increasingly sort of hereditary, almost a monarchy, and very much autocratic. So that sense of equality within the Ummah is sort of lost at these higher levels. What they do, however, that's extraordinarily successful is they have this approach to conquest that is very tolerant. So anyone they encounter who is considered a people of the book, so other Christians or Jews, are given a sort of a limited toleration. So they have to pay a specific tax called the jizya, but in return for that tax, they get legal recognition. They have their own courts. They have sort of limited trading rights and economic rights, but they are given protection. So they are actually given military protection. And in part, because you have a history of division in that sort of part of the Middle East, especially along Jerusalem, and you can see here Armenia. So you have Armenian Christians who have been actually persecuted by the Orthodox Church in Constantinople, the Byzantine Church. And you have these people called Nestorian Christians who have also been the target of persecution by the Eastern Orthodox Church, because Orthodoxy wants uniformity and they don't want all these different Christian groups. So what some of these local groups find is that these Muslim elites are actually more tolerant than other Christian elites. And so you have very limited resistance in some of these places to this sort of expanding Muslim control. Sort of the next sort of wave of caliphs is called the Abbasid caliphs. So as you can see, they are going to continue to rule in one form or another for a considerable portion of time. Al-Abbas actually claims a blood relationship to Muhammad. He overthrows the Umayyad Caliph. He moves the capital to Baghdad. He begins to introduce sort of a standing army, so a paid army, mercenaries, slaves. He brings some nomadic groups in from the east. And increasingly, he's reliant upon these nomadic groups, these sort of non-Muslims, at least initially, as the backbone of his army. And this is increasingly going to make the Abbasid Caliphate more and more vulnerable because he's sort of ceded this military power to this external group. And so what we start to see then is around the time of the Abbasid Caliph, further fragmentation. So the establishment of the Caliphate of Cordoba, this is in modern day Spain. So this is Iberia. So what happens is in 711, Tariq, who is a local sort of Berber chieftain, leads a group of Berbers in and sort of creates sort of a foothold into modern day Spain. And then they start to try and carve out territory. Spain at this time is Christian controlled, but part of the unrest further over in the central part of the caliphate in Baghdad led to the exile of Abd al-Rahman. And Abd al-Rahman is actually sort of the last Umayyad. So the Abbasids attempted to kill him all off. He survives. So Abd al-Rahman flees, ends up in Iberia, and establishes this sort of unified Muslim caliphate that does not have any sort of connection to the Abbasid Caliphate. So it's an independent caliphate over in Iberia. And then that fragmentation continues. A little bit later on, we see the Caliphate of Cairo. So this is centered on Egypt, but also at times controls sort of Jerusalem and Palestine and Iberia, those very sort of central areas, and also North Africa and Tunisia. The Caliphate of Cairo are actually Ismaili Shia. So they're also known as Fatimids. So they are not Sunni like the Abbasid caliphs. They are different. And this again is going to explain part of that division that the Christians are going to encounter. So the next group to sort of move into this area are these Seljuk Turks. And initially they're sort of brought in by the Abbasid caliphs to sort of staff their army, but increasingly they infiltrate the army, they rise through the ranks, many of them convert to Islam and start to occupy real positions of power. And so they establish sort of independent control. So by 850, you can see they've sort of broken off in the north here and have established this sultanate of their own. So initially, these are slaves and soldiers who sort of rise through the ranks. By 1060, they're powerful enough that they capture Baghdad. And so then the Abbasid Caliph is really just reduced to a figurehead. He's still there. He really only has sort of religious duties. And it's the Sultan, or sort of the leading member of the Seljuk Turks at the time, who exercises real political authority. And at one point in 1071, sort of sending shockwaves through this through the Western world. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks meet the the Byzantine emperor and his army at the Battle of Manzikert. And you can see Manzikert here, how far north that is. This actually results in the imprisonment, temporary, of the Byzantine emperor, but it allows Turkish expansion further into Asia Minor, so that they establish the Seljuk Sultanate of the Rome. And so they're right up to, they border that sort of Constantinople and that Byzantine Empire. And this is the furthest sort of north that the Muslims have been able to expand. In 1092, that sultan who had unified these Seljuk Turks actually dies. And instead of a single successor, you have fragmentation into four real sort of regional chieftains. And they are constantly fighting back and forth. There's a lot of rivalry. There's a lot of alliances back and forth. A lot of instability here in the north. And that's going to be key to what the Christians are going to encounter when they come in. So all of this fragmentation across sort of what was this unified Muslim empire is really going to provide opportunities for the Crusaders. You also have the splinter group, who we're going to come back to now and again, because even though they're very marginal and they're very small, they have sort of an outsized impact. They're called assassins. We really don't know much about their history. They sort of trace their legacy back to someone named Asas, and they have sort of a fortress in the mountains at Hassan Asaba, where they sort of retreat to. They are Ismaili Shia, so another sort of Shia splinter group within a dominant Sunni population at times. The fortress is Alamut, which is established in 1090. So they're essentially kind of like a military order. So they're literally trained assassins, and they have, so Hassan Asaba is the person who's in charge when the Crusaders get there. And they really sort of indiscriminately will target whoever seems to be their enemy at the time. So this is sort of a map then of the Middle East in 1050. You can see all these divisions in the Muslim world, and that really is going to make them very vulnerable to the Crusaders when the Crusaders come in, because the Crusaders are able to sort of ally with different Muslim groups, pit them against each other, and sort of maximize their ability to infiltrate the area, even though their army is much smaller.